Welcome to the Free the Bear podcast, a podcast devoted to California independence, where two guys talk about how crappy the government is and how dumb politicians can be, and that there might be another way. So sit back, enjoy, and as always,
Free the bear. Grrr.
You guys have such creative and positive energy behind your movement. I want to learn from it and steal it for ourselves.
I love stealing. That's the rule number one for any movement is steal good ideas. I love it.
Oh, great. Yeah, Forbes is here. We could just start everything now that Prince Forbes is here.
I know. You see, Brandon, this is kind of abuse I have to deal with. You know, we're trying to just start up a podcast, and it's just endless here. It's just a little jibes, little shots. You know, I don't know what to say anymore.
Sounds rough.
Yeah,
it's a very rough deal. So happy to have you here. Again, Cascadia is a very exciting thing. I've been reading about Cascadia for a long time, so I mean, this is very interesting. Thanks for having the time to actually talk with us.
My pleasure.
So, Brandon, my first half question for you is, where can people learn more information about Cascadia, and if you want, where can people learn more about you?
People can learn more at the Cascadia Department of Bioregion, departmentofbioregion.org, as well as the Cascadia Wikipedia article. And by giving Cascadia Bioregion, just throw it into a search engine in Google, and you'll probably find several different results and several different rabbit holes that will lead you to at least a few hours of reading.
That's really what it's about at the end, to just Google it and find the information yourself. My first question, and I'll be honest, I know the answer, but more for the audience, what is bioregionalism?
Sure. So bioregionalism is a way that we define our geography through our natural boundaries and borders rather than human-defined borders. And so for Cascadia, the Cascadia bioregion is the watersheds of the Fraser, the Snake, and the Columbia rivers that all together kind of help define both the place, the culture, the people, and the inhabitants of the Pacific Northwest. And more than that, bioregionalism is a philosophy, and it's really about rooting ourselves into place. So it's a place-based philosophy that helps empower every person to be active and engaged about issues they care about. And really working on, one of our main goals is to shift our organizational frameworks to a bioregional framework from, our current federal system of states and counties and cities and national borders that are really arbitrarily defined by, it doesn't reflect the reality of the place or the people, and oftentimes was defined and named after people who never set foot here or didn't live here. And because of that, it tends to be very much a system based in disenfranchisement.
What was it that made you decide it's time for Cascadia to become its own nation? What were some of the tipping points for you?
I first stumbled onto the idea in 2004 when I was in class at Seattle Central Community College, and I was taking a class, and we were reading a book by a Maori author named Linda Tuhai Smith, and it was on decolonizing methodologies. And one of those steps was to really step back and strip away all of the reality that kind of currently sat, and to envision what a better society would look like, if the arbitrary and colonial borders and boundaries didn't exist. And at that same time, I stumbled on the idea of Cascadia and bioregionalism. And at that point, there wasn't very much there. There was some earlier links to the Cascadia bioregional movement in the 80s, and there was Alexander Baratek had a website up talking about his flag, and then there was some joke sites and some other stuff, and I kind of just looked at it and I took it a little bit too seriously, and I just thought it was a great idea. And so at that point I launched Cascadia Now, the Cascadia Independence Project, with the idea of promoting a positive and inclusive vision that just argued that we live in an amazing place and we think that we can be doing better here.
One of the biggest things that happens is that we're too wrapped up in these kind of artificial borders. Is that pretty much like one of the biggest talking points, is that we're so caught up in these, like, okay, they had the borders of like California or Texas or something like that. But that was all just basically drawn on maps. That had nothing to really do with the people in the area. Especially like for a more extreme example, like the Middle East. That was just pretty much French and British colonial rulers just going with the ruler and this so to speak. Rulers going with the ruler and actually just going through and just like drawing like squares and like, okay, that's our territory. This is this. You're trying to move away from that, and I guess that's what you mean by decolonization, pretty much.
Yeah, totally. And I think that, I think one of the big things that bioregionalism allows us is it really lets us have conversations for what are systems that are better able to represent our place and the people living here. And I think that something that I've watched happen a lot is that people get really wrapped up in working along federal borders or working along state lines that don't take into account the entire picture. And so when you are working within systems that are already framed against you, quite often it's a losing battle before you've already begun. And so what bioregionalism in Cascadia allows us to do is it allows us to create our own arguments and our own frameworks and then say, hey, why aren't we doing this? And isn't this a better way that we can be living? And I think that you see this a lot where, California, the ecology of California doesn't stop just because you go south or just because you go north into Oregon. And here in Cascadia, I mean, one of the biggest examples that we point to is, nature acts bioregionally. Just because you draw a giant line in the middle of it between British Columbia and Washington doesn't mean that we're not a part of the same ecosystem. And it doesn't mean that, that we can't be working together in the face of forest fires or flooding or droughts or, here we're here along the Cascadia subduction zone. And so that's potentially a huge earthquake, a huge natural disaster. And when that happens, it will be a regional event, and it won't stop just because we draw a line there.
One of the reasons I'm so excited to have you on this episode is it gives me an excuse to talk about the most influential nonfiction book in my life, The 9 Nations of North America by Joel Garreau, which was my introduction to bioregionalism.
Oh, that's great.
He talks about ecotopia. He talks about basically I think I'm literally like right on the border. So I think I'm still in California, but it's like Sonoma County, all the way Humboldt and up is actually more aligned with the Pacific Northwest than it is California. So my question for you is, how much of California are you guys going to take from us?
Well, I think, the first thing is that's important is you guys need to jump up and take some credit for bioregionalism because you're right. I think some of the foundational work and the seminal work, the 9 Nations of North America was great. And before that, in 1975, you had Ernest Kallenbach, who is a California-based writer, who really wrote the book Ecotopia. It inspired a lot of people. And at that same point in time, San Francisco came down and visited recently. But you have Planet Drum Foundation, Judy Goldhalf, and Peter Berg, who, along with several other people, created the idea of bioregionalism. And, people like to call it the oldest new idea, we say created, but only really what we mean by that is to have it enter into Western kind of concepts, but because it's been around and practiced for obviously hundreds of years and thousands of years. But I think it's important, firstly, to realize that this idea of bioregionalism really is a West Coast idea. And it started in San Francisco and it worked north through the 70s. And then, and also Gary Snyder, another very famous bioregionalist and poet, very big. And then, so in the 70s and 80s, it kind of worked north. And then 1981, David McCloskey really kind of gave definition to the bioregion of Cascadia and named it Cascadia. And then 1986, we actually started to have these bioregional congresses that were able to bring delegates and so forth. And so it's kind of an interesting path, but I think it's important to also recognize that California plays a really large part in that. In terms of California and how far south Cascadia extends, I think what's fun about bioregionalism is that culture stems from place, and ultimately it'll be the people who decide. From a bioregional perspective, it goes all the way down to Cape Mendocino. Also, who knows? Maybe there's the state of Jefferson, which could be a middle ground or a buffer point. Ultimately, it's the people there living there who are probably the best able to speak for their needs and talk about who they identify with culturally.
You have, I mean, the movement goes across like state lines, federal lines, national lines. Where do you think there's more of a support from? Do you think it's coming from more the Canadian side of things as they stand now, or do you think again it's more of an American movement that has like hints of Canada? Well, which way do you think that again, if you had to kind of like make a bet, like which side would actually be more willing to kind of engage in the, like what would be basically one of the grandest political experiments?
You know what's really beautiful about this idea is that Cascadia is basically, if you love the Pacific Northwest, you are a Cascadian, whether you know it or not. And what's beautiful is when we set up a table, when we talk, when we give an event, we have everybody from, people in their 70s and 80s who literally read Ecotopia the first time around to high school students, who come up and talk to us about, and one of my favorite things is that when we're tabling or talking is the people who come up and kind of say, man, I just heard about Cascadia this year, but I've been Cascadian all my life. And I think that that's beautiful because it really sums up the sentiment. And that is that if you live here and you love it here and you want a better future for us and everyone, then you are a Cascadian. And because of that, it has a really strong appeal. Our supporter base is many thousands of people. And when we map the zip codes or the area codes, it creates a bioregion. And that's a really wonderful thing to see. And I think that the support for the idea stretches both in British Columbia as well as Washington. And it also stretches really well in rural parts of Cascadia, just as well as it plays in urban areas of Cascadia. There's a lot of different reasons for that. British Columbia has always had a history where that has really moved west and has been different from other parts of Canada. We're very far removed from other population centers. And because of that, we have a very strong regional affinity. Seattle and Vancouver are 180 miles away, and yet we're divided and we share the same ecosystem. We share the Salish Sea, and yet we are divided by a federal border. And that's also tribal territory. That is First Nation land that has also been. So when you talk about, the Peace Arch and these places, it's a very special place because it literally crosses First Nations, city, state, federal lines, everything in between, and yet we are so similar. And so I think, and actually, it's really interesting. British Columbia has a stronger affiliation for Washington and Washington for British Columbia than any other part of Canada. And also because British Columbia doesn't have a stigma, of the Civil War and, with movements like Quebec, the idea tends to be very, very strong. And, I'll even point out that more people in British Columbia have an affiliation and feel culturally aligned with California than they do any other province in Canada.
I think the other thing people don't realize with both the California independence movement and the Cascadian movement is our founding fathers were supportive of it. I was actually reading, I think the other day, about how a lot of the founding fathers thought west of the Rockies should be its own nation. That the mountains were a great, defining, border. And I hope people start to realize that both of us, both Cascadia and California, the federal government is thousands of miles away from us. It's in different time zones. And just by those things, I feel that we are underrepresented.
Well, there's never been, and I think, California aside, there's never been a president from Cascadia. I think that, there's always, one of our main arguments is that the people living here will always be better able to represent their own interests and needs than thousands of miles away in a place where there is no vested interest in representing us. And so I think that that's a really important point. Not only are we underrepresented, but it's also just thousands of miles away with little or no vested interest in who we are or our future other than resource extraction and economic, concerns.
Yeah, that's a very valid point because it seems like, people will make the counter argument that, because of the internet, the way we have communications now is not as remote as it once was. And I suppose that's true. But really, again, they don't, like you said, they don't have an investment because they actually really don't live around here. They don't really know the area. Again, they're not really with the people too much. They're not really culturally attuned to what the local culture is like. How do you plan to or is there a plan, I should say, of like having a more representative system? I mean, it's one thing to say, to kind of break away and have like a Cascadia, but it always sounds like you guys are going with very advanced ideas. I mean, again, like the bioregion as opposed to just a simple nation state. How would you best represent people, like say, tomorrow Cascadia goes independent? How would you best represent the people in the area that doesn't become like, whatever the future capital is still as remote as Washington, D.C. in some ways? Or again, like, but say the capital of Canada.
Sure. I think, it's a great question. And ultimately, it's a question best left for the people living here. And I think that's one of our number one arguments is that we don't have all the answers. And that's fine. Because what we want to do is we want to have an honest conversation. And we want to have an honest conversation that includes the First Nations living here. And we want to have a conversation with the rural areas as well as, as well as the urban parts. And I think what's great is that when we have that discussion and it's the people living here, we're going to have a lot of really amazing answers. We have 16 million people living here. We have, one of the world's top GDP per capita. It's an area larger than Mongolia. It'd be, the 20th largest, country in the world, by size. And so it's just, there's so many different elements that where we can really be working to do better. And I think that, that starts with a constituent assembly. And that would probably be one of our first steps, that if we were ever to remove ourselves, it would be to gather the experts, gather the people together. When we look around the world, I think you can describe Cascadia, we talk about bioregionalism, but it's also a pro-democracy movement. And so it is an idea that is invested with principles of human rights and rights for the inhabitants of everything that lives here. I think that we need to be having a really critical examination of how do we do that, and how do we increase the livability in the face of climate change, and how do we increase livability in of economic collapse. And I think that what's great is by having that conversation with everybody living here, we will all be happier for it. One of the first things, people always say, well, it should be east of the Cascades or west of the Cascades. But, the nice thing is that whether you live in Seattle or Spokane, we can both agree that maybe we shouldn't have the same government, that we shouldn't be a part of the same state. And that if we break those things apart, culture stems from place. So there's going to be different needs, and that's just fine. And by having that discussion, we can come to systems that are much more democratic and much more humane, and that really do, that are smarter and more transparent and more dynamic. More than that like can fit into, a global marketplace in a way that's ethical and sustainable and responsible. Because I think that's what we're really going to need in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years as we enter this kind of era of peak warming and catastrophe.
I think you guys you've been around a little longer than the California National Party. And I think one thing that you just hit on there is something we're working on. So I suppose I'll ask for advice. Obviously California is a primarily Democratic state, but it's really just in the few dense population areas. How do you work with rural areas that are very much Republican? How do you, I don't want to say convince them, but what is your pitch to them to tell them that they're better off in a Cascadian nation rather than being part of America?
What's funny is people assume that I think that Cascadia is left or right, and what's really funny is it's place-based, and so it really aligns well to it actually incorporates a lot of different elements that are traditionally libertarian or actually fairly conservative. And so the idea of removing ourselves from a vast and bureaucratic federal government, that plays well no matter where you live. And more than that we want to empower the communities and the people, and that people are going to have different needs, and that we want to break down big government and really make it, start from the communities. But the honest answer is that, we don't convince people, because we're very lucky that, again, if you love it here and you want a better future, you are Cascadian. And so we have a lot of ranchers and Cascadians and who are very conservative. And what's nice is that, we can agree to disagree. And that's also a very, traditionally conservative concept. And so, and I do think that, here throughout our bioregion, we do have kind of a unique brand of this kind of like libertarian progressivism, which is very much a live and let live, that if you're not harming another person, you should have the right to live however you're going to. and that those are freedoms that should be guaranteed, and that every different community should really be able to speak for itself. But that's always like a discussion that we're having that's ongoing. But certainly, the biggest and most important thing is to make it positive and make it about a shared vision and a shared future that we're all a part of. And it doesn't matter if you're, east of the Cascades or west of the Cascades, because ultimately we all share the same watershed. So whether we disagree politically in a system that's based on disenfranchisement and these arbitrary lines, really doesn't matter when you pull that away, because we share the same watershed. We share, and regardless of that, there's forest fires, we need to be working together. If there's flooding, we need to be working together. If we're talking about food sovereignty, that's where our food comes from. We need to be working together, and that's a discussion for all of us. Washington, Oregon by itself will never be able to have that. West of the Cascades by itself will never be able to have that. And so ultimately, it will take the entire Cascadia bioregion working along a single shared administrative framework if we're going to tackle issues like environmental degradation, pollution, salmon, dams, or starting to institute policies for really curbing wildfires and shared fiber sheds and energy independence. That's a conversation for all of us, and one that we're excited and willing to have with every different community living here.
What do you think is like? I mean, we're kind of talking like, again, we're like, that copying good ideas from each other, right? Again, like, we have shared movements, or again, we have like movements that are trying to achieve certain things. Do you have, or has the Cascadia movement like come up with any kind of like game plan about how to try to get the ball rolling here? Because like, for example, like in California, like, there's a lot of talk about like getting like, members elected to the assembly, for example, or raising out enough signatures so that we can have a initiative on our future ballot. Do you guys have any kind of like a grand strategy you've been thinking of politically about how to kind of like start it so that, again, you can move towards a future independence, like, for example, like an electoral campaign or anything else of that matter?
I think what California is doing is a wonderful idea and a wonderful strategy. And I think one of the most important things that we've talked about is really defining the shared principles for what Cascadia stands for, so that people know exactly what it means when people say it and exactly what those steps are. And I watched, California, at the Unity conference, I thought that was a perfect example, because ultimately, whether we agree or disagree, we need to have space for all of us under this umbrella if we're really going to succeed. And if we're too busy fighting amongst ourselves, like, we should be working in mutual aid, solidarity, and supporting efforts, because we're all going to have different strengths that we bring to the table, and we're going to all have different issues and passions, and we're going to have different language that addresses out to different communities. And so finding those spaces where we can agree to disagree, but still work together as a family, towards a stronger goal and mission, I think is really important. And I do think that all the answers that you're looking for are in history. And I think, especially in this country and around the world, there are such amazing examples of creative individuals coming together and really changing things where people said they never could before. I personally spent, one of, I think the really formative moments of my own personal life was that in 2012, I spent 4 months with two friends living in Tunisia, and we were there for the 1-year anniversary of the Arab Spring. And we were there studying and learning about their constituent assembly that they had there, in a country of several million people that had lived under brutal dictatorship for decades, and where no one saw this change coming. The government ended up being brittle, and when that government toppled, there was a vacuum, and they came together to introduce things like gender parity. And within the first several months, I think there were, by the time of the election, just for electing the body of people that were going to write the Constitution and discuss it, that would go to a vote, there were 85 different political parties. After the election, there were 112 political parties. And that's in a country that has, that was, like lived under an authoritarian regime that allowed no freedom of expression and anything like that. And so I think it's inspirational, and that you should never go by what people think is possible or not possible. The best that we can do is put ideas forward that we know are good ideas and that we know are better and helping and healthy and the pathway forward. And then you just never know what in history is going to happen and what might happen. And so, trying to be prepared for it is definitely an idea. Personally, and for the Cascadia movement, I think, things that we are looking at, and we're looking at California. We've looked at, yes, Scotland and the Scottish National Party, I think, was very inspirational for us for a long time. Before that, we also looked at Quebec. And I think the key is that what we want to really be careful of is that getting an idea to a vote is one potential pathway, but getting a majority of people to vote yes is the ultimate goal. And so how do we connect an idea to people's hearts in a way where they really believe and value the concept? And so that's really what we've kind of worked with. And it is important to note that Cascadia is not just a political idea. It's not just, an idea based on independence. It is for many people. But more than that, bioregionalism is a social, cultural, economic, and political idea. And so, rather than just waiting, for to go to a voting box every 4 years in a system that's rigged and, takes endless amounts of money and time and that you can come out of it with nothing, we also want to find ways that we can be empowering people on a daily basis. And what we want is to find a way that every person, regardless of ability, background, or whatever, can walk out their front door, get involved about issues they care about, or raise awareness with their own voice, connect in, plug in with people in their community, find the people who are already making those changes happen, and then see people supported in making those changes. And so it's kind of a dual system in that way, that on the one hand, we're working to remove ourselves from federal systems that are toxic and negative and arbitrary. But on the other hand, we are also trying to build our own systems that make those systems obsolete. So we're not just working within the framework of a national system, but that we're actually building something better, and that if we're able to, when we remove ourselves, not just fall into the same traps of the same capitalist structures. Certainly, here, I think San Francisco and California is the same way, but within Cascadia, there is such extreme wealth disparity between people sleeping on the streets and some of the largest tech companies and billionaires. And so finding and striking that balance that can really recognize those issues and actually address them in an equitable way, it is one of our primary objectives, and one of the things that we will always continue to work on.
Would you kind of say that, if I'm kind of like reading this right, or reading what you're saying right, you pretty much that the Cascadian movement is based more on a movement of saying, how do you put this, giving forward more positive ideas, like not like so much what you're against, because there's plenty of things that we could be against, there's plenty of things that we're already discouraged about or upset about, but the Cascadian movement really wants to focus more on the positives to bring forward this kind of a common vision for a lot of people, that everyone has kind of a stake in it somehow, in some way. Is that what I'm kind of, if that's a way to
I think that's well said. At its own, it's not about what we're against, it's about what we're for. And when we make that change and we create our own frameworks, then all of a sudden we've shifted the discussion, and we're no longer arguing that something is bad or this or that, or we're not arguing against what's an action that someone else is doing, which is reactive. So we're always losing the tempo because they're always changing. There's always going to be another pipeline or another, this or that, where you spend all your energy and time. And so instead, we're just going to create our own systems, create our own language. And now they have to argue and defend why that's not a good idea. And I think that shift in perspective and tempo is really important.
Another reason why it's important to have you on our program is if either of us gets independence, it is going to cause a chain reaction that will make independence vastly easier for the other group. I find the biggest opposition I get to California independence isn't based on anything other than, it won't happen.
Correct.
If one of us can make it happen and that argument goes away, boy, things are going to change fast.
Yes, and I think that's also really important, that it's important to reach out. Those people, are always going to be there, and they'll be there till they won't. And the way that they won't be there is just by proving them wrong and showing them. And so it's really important to reach out with your 10 or 15% of people who are really like committed and willing to be a part of the idea. And for us, what's really interesting is that people assume that Cascadia, oh, it's just a bunch of privileged whatever people. And what we've found is actually the opposite. That traditionally it's actually marginalized communities that are facing persecution and erasure on a daily basis that are the most willing for radical change, because they do not have the privilege of safety that a lot of white middle class people have. And so I think really tapping into that and also saying like, hey, this is a safe space, and we need to be working for all of our citizens who right now literally don't have the rights to have their genders recognized, or who have faced literally hundreds of years of slavery or genocide, or who are losing their green cards or being put into cages on the border. I mean, there are people facing battles for their very livelihoods right now, or that are at risk, who might be killed because they get stopped, and they are fed up. And I think that that's a really important thing. And so it's important to realize that there's an ideological perspective to be had around bioregionalism, and this is for human rights. But then there's also a very practical perspective that, I think that, the United States, and also to some extent to Canada with how they've been treating First Nations and Indigenous peoples, our countries are descending into, a way of living, and have for a long time, and against, different communities, have treated them very badly. And that we need to really work to, as a community and group of people, work to address that, and actually create a pathway forward that can involve truth and reconciliation for those different things. And so that's also a really, important thing to talk about as well.
You mentioned that you spent some time in Tunisia during the upheaval, or I guess in the aftermath of the upheaval, and you were witnessing firsthand the Constituent Assembly. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
And when you did that, was there anything that really stood out to you that maybe doesn't have a historical parallel, or maybe something that happened there that really stuck in your mind that maybe people are not really talking about when it comes to these these kind of revolutionary situations? Is there something that kind of like this kind of just stuck in your mind that you're basically like, what, I've read about these kind of situations in books constantly, left and right, I've talked to people left and right, but I don't know if anyone picked up on this particular fact or this particular like something or generality from that situation?
Sure. Well, I've got a lot, and I've got a lot of different stories. I mean, it was a really incredible time. But, I think more than that, I think that something that's just really important is like the entire time, we were the only Americans staying there. There was very strong anti-American sentiment, but never did we ever feel in danger. Never did we feel unsafe. And for much of the country, they live on under $2 a day. But there was no homelessness. There was no, it was a really interesting place and time to be, because it really did challenge a lot of our conceptions, and they had really strong, familial connections and relations and societal systems to set up to deal with poverty, so that even if someone was out of work and, didn't have a place to live, that they wouldn't starve, and that they wouldn't sleep on the streets. And so I found that really impressive. And I also just the amazing and unbridled creativity and passion of people when given that opportunity for voice to really step forward and talk, to be really powerful and very inspirational. Every public space really turned into a space for political discussion, whether it was an alleyway with street art, with going back and forth between different types of graffiti, to different occupations that were happening, to all the different like immediate forms of advertising, for a country that also does have a lot of illiteracy. And so ways that, creative ways that were created for reaching out to people, all the different newspapers that were started up by student groups and people, who had maybe never been politically active before, who were finally able to openly announce, from liberal parties to communist parties to anarchists to religious groups. And ultimately, I think what was really interesting is their desire and effort to, institute things like gender parity. They wanted to create a government, after emerging out of an authoritarian one-party system. They wanted to create a government where that would never happen again. Whether or not that succeeded, there's a lot of discussion and debate, because, obviously, a religious a very powerful religious party that had been persecuted for several decades, did get into power. But the way that the government was structured was this attempt at this really amazing multi-party democracy where they did have gender parity enforced, where candidates had to be alternating genders. And so that's really interesting, is so that even in this little country, that's kind of billed as being very religious and conservative, they now have a higher gender parity in their government than the United States does. And so I think it's always just important to take things with a grain of salt, to critically examine, and then to really have faith in the creativity of people.
How is President Trump's, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say, attempted occupation of Cascadia, how has that affected your movement?
Yeah, I would say that there's no better way to support Cascadia than to send federally armed forces to occupy it. It's really funny. We've had stickers for years that says, U.S. out of Cascadia, or that treat, the United States as an occupying force. And it's always been kind of a lighthearted ha-ha. And so now I think what we're really seeing, and we saw it, here in Seattle, we also had the Capitol Hill occupied protest. And then now certainly in Portland, there, when they sent federal forces, that protest had been entering its, I think, 50, it had been going on for 50 days. By doing that, you gave a focal point to a movement that was able to revitalize it. And it really does trigger people, and of all ages and all backgrounds, now coming together to say, absolutely not. Federal forces need to leave. They're not welcome here. And that's from every different local official. And when you have every different local official saying, no, they are not welcome here, it is an occupation. It is no longer, it is not at the request of the people living there. It's not at the request of the representatives of the people living there. So it is an unlawful occupation from our eyes. And more than that, it's giving a focal point for a movement that, and giving a huge revitalization and boost for a lot of people who are fed up and saying it's not okay.
Oh, Forbes, Brandon and I were talking earlier before you came on that, for the longest time, California had been kind of thought of as the quintessential progressive state. Forbes, would you agree that Cascadia has kind of taken that mantle from us, so we have to step up our game?
I think so. It's kind of, California in American politics is kind of like a punching bag, for the right. There's always, again, like talking about this, like that somehow California is this hippy dippy, out of control, uber liberal state, which is very much not true, especially when it comes to inequality, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to matters of wealth. California is very, very regressive. There might be certain things you can point out that are very quote unquote liberal when it comes to certain policies, when it comes to different racial groups, gender groups, things like that. But really, again, that's such a straw man argument. It's ridiculous. California is nowhere near really what a Cascadia is, and it's very funny to me to actually even think that Donald Trump and his supporters have made such a boogeyman out of California that really it has no basis in reality. And actually Cascadia, or again, the areas around Cascadia, that there really are more what they should be talking about, I guess, in a certain way, because that actually is a progressive community, and we're definitely not a progressive community. We just have a big D next to our name, and that's about it. And we have people of color and women in certain positions of power, but that's all window dressing, really. The state is very, very backwards in much other ways.
Well, I think it's also important to realize, I think there's a big difference between liberal and progressive. And also, but Cascadia by all means, has so much work to do. And I think what's nice is, when you talk about gay marriage or legalizing weed, there are aspects that we are ahead on, but I don't think that there is any progressive areas or not progressive or liberal. Oregon has an income tax and no sales tax, but then maybe they have other, but then they have there's a lot of issues still of white supremacy all throughout Cascadia. And there's a lot of different American, very, Idaho is its own thing, right? And so I think even while there are some of the most progressive policies in Cascadia, I also argue that we still have some of the most regressive policies. Our teachers are still incredibly woefully underpaid, but we also do have really good, when Obama set up the universal healthcare system in Washington state, They really embraced it. And something that I've really appreciated is watching how our local governments have stepped up in a Cascadian fashion to fight the federal government when injustice is being proposed. And they have done that consistently, whether it's on the behalf of refugees, immigrants, or even, when Trump was just being elected, one of the things that the Washington State Health Authority did is they got everybody together and they said, all right, what else are we going to cover? And they made things like HIV treatment fall under the category of disability so that no one would lose life-threatening access to medicine. And so there are these things, and watching our state attorney, and I know California, has, and Oregon, they all have very powerful, very active state attorneys that are continually suing successfully actions of the federal government. And that is honestly one of the things that makes me the most proud to live in Cascadia, and where I do feel like we really all do come together in a way that unites us. A lot of Cascadians, they don't actually live in Cascadia. They live around the world, and they live in other parts of the United States, and they don't realize they're Cascadian until they leave. And then they go, oh, I get it, because culturally we are distinct. And I think when we are talking about progressive discussions, I think when we are talking about ideas of gender, when we're talking about types of radical direct democracy, delegative democracy, star voting, ranked choice voting, when we're talking about all of these different ideas and there is a lot of very radical thought happening where, well, okay, we don't like capitalism. What does that mean? What does that look like? And those discussions are happening, and I don't think that they're happening in other parts of the country. I do think that they are happening along the West Coast, but I certainly think that when people move to the Northeast or when they move to the Southeast, or you don't see those discussions and you don't see that same type of thinking. And I do think that is a very Cascadian and a very West Coast idea and discussion. And what's fun is that we support independence, sovereignty, and autonomy, no matter where it is. And ultimately, as a pro-democracy movement, it's the people living here who gets to decide what that looks like. And so we talk a lot about bioregionalism because it's important to base our policy choices in bioregions and have that bioregional framework for decision making. But ultimately, there are several different ways that idea could evolve, And so you talked about ecotopia. Well, so ecotopia is Washington, Oregon, Northern California. Then you hear people talk about Pacifica. And so that's the West Coast. That's your West Coast block of California, Oregon, Washington together. And then Cascadia being the bioregion that then incorporates British Columbia. And so I think, the important thing is really, to continue to inspire people's imagination for what's possible, and don't get bogged down in letting our reality be defined by people who do not have our best interests, at heart. And let's define our own reality. Let's define our own future that we get to build together in a positive way by the people living here who have the most invested in that. And as long as we can continue to inspire the imagination, whether or not independence happens this year or next year, we will continue to be working together to make our world a better place. And we don't need people in Washington, D.C. or Ottawa to tell us how to do that. That's something that we can be doing every day.
You said something that it really made some sense to me. I was a New Englander, born and raised. And it's not only is it environment, but there is a different way of politics. Even though you could consider New England to be a blue area, it's not as progressive as the West Coast, but I will say the Republicans are much more centrist in New England compared to West Coast Republicans. Like, it's very hard in New England to find a lot of pro-lifers or people who are anti-gay marriage. Right now, the Republicans have a very old school libertarian streak to them in comparison. But what I wanted to talk about, both of the California independence movement and the Cascadia movement clearly has roots in the environment and protecting the environment more than the federal government wants to. How much do you think that has to do with the fact that, we were discovered later by Europe, and that I would say maybe our city designs or our population densities are just a lot different than those on the East Coast or in the Midwest?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, so I call this, we've seen a tree. And I say that because people in the Northwest or California or the Cascadia bioregion traditionally have probably seen a tree, an actual old growth tree grown to its full extent, that is hundreds of years old. And, only in the continuous in the United States, 2% of old growth forests still remain, almost exclusively in the Western United States, almost exclusively in California and the Cascadia bioregion. And I feel like when you've seen a tree, you know what is at risk and you know what we are losing when those trees are cut down. And so, when people are talking about climate change, when people are talking about logging, it's not just an abstract notion. And we talk a lot about how culture defines place. Well, that also goes for cities and our urban and built environments. And so when you live and you go to Boston, I mean, I've been to Boston and Rhode Island and these other areas, and a lot of these cities, you will not see one old growth tree, or there might be a few in a yard somewhere that was preserved. And how that defines our culture and what we think of as even home. For some people, home is apartments, and and they, it could be condos or apartments, and they travel to office buildings in apartments and tower buildings, and they get into a car and they do that and they use Google Maps. And I think that it talks about how even just our experience of where we live and how we live is a political environment. And it informs us, and it informs how we view our world and how we relate to our world. What I love about bioregionalism is it just gets into this, into everything, down to how our maps, how our maps are created. Like, maps are political tools. They are how we relate to our broader world. And no map is created without a political or economic agenda behind it. So when a map is created by a nation state, it uses roads and cities and economic markers for the things that you care about. And when Google Maps creates Google Maps and an app that you use every day, when it says take a left at the Burger King, it's doing that because of a paid advertiser to advance its own economic interest. And so what I love about bioregionalism is it fakes it till it makes it, and it brings it back, and it creates new maps and new territories where we relate to our world in a different way. And we relate to our world through our environment, both culturally and economically, but especially through our watersheds and our fiber sheds and our food sheds. And it says this is how we should be orienting ourselves, and this is how we should be structuring our society. And I think that there's something very subversive in that. And I really enjoy, playing around with those lines of what's official, what's not official, and how do we see and relate to the world and people around us.
It sounds like what you're talking about is that really, again, we're under this kind of like mental, psychological grip about certain things. And that part of the Cascadia movement, and I guess in a lesser extent, the California movement, is that we have to kind of unlearn these things that we've learned, that we have to move beyond the idea of, the United States is always united. Right, Canada's always going to be Canada. Certain lines are already drawn in the sand. That's just the way it is, done and done. You're talking about that we have to really, again, for lack of a better term, kind of like turn off the programming that we already have in our heads, and that's probably one of the biggest obstacles, basically. Correct?
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I think that the biggest thing, if we really want to get away from these frameworks that are like the national, that are really harmful to our communities, is we have to stop working within them, and we have to stop propagating them, and we have to stop sharing them. And one of the best ways to do that is to find healthy frameworks and healthy systems and start using those. And a lot of times we have to create them, because I think that the United States and colonial governments and the Canadian government have spent hundreds of years erasing those and making sure that you have a dependency and a framework which you learn for 8 hours a day in schools, that is the way that you relate to the world, and it is the only way that you relate to the world. Cascadia being a cross-border region is a really interesting example, because the reason why we create so many resources is because they don't exist. We create maps of areas that include forest types. Okay, well, if you live in the United States and you try to create that map, it will stop at the Washington border. If you're in British Columbia, it will stop at the British Columbian border. And so, that goes for so many different things, whether it's what's the GDP of Cascadia? What's the GDP of BC, Washington, Oregon? What's the GDP of the Cascadia bioregion? And if you can't answer that, then it's not a real thing. But the minute that you can define it and give an answer, it becomes real. And so, and not only that, but it becomes a more efficient way of operating. And so here in Cascadia, there is no collective map that has been distributed that has like the indigenous First Nations of both south of the border and north of the border. Here in Seattle, we used to, we lived on the Puget Sound, and up in BC, it was the Prince Georgia, Strait, one name south of the border, one name north of the border. Well, the fact that they're part of the same body didn't account. And so now in 2012, they renamed it the Salish Sea. It's the Salish Sea ecoregion. That's a part of the Cascadia bioregion because it better represents the place and the people who have always lived here. And I think that as we move forward, it makes a lot of sense. And so you have all of our governors and local governments and corporations working together and working to break down those borders, because they literally inhibit our region's ability to respond to earthquakes, to respond to forest fires, to talk about pollution and how we cooperate with that. And so because of that, we have this innovation happening that is actually more efficient than a national framework. And you see it in, Jay Inslee and I think the BC Premier are working on the Cascadia Innovation Corridor. You have Kate Brown, the governor of Oregon, working with BC and Washington on high-speed rail to run from Eugene, Oregon, through Portland, through Seattle, up to Vancouver, BC. You have Microsoft working with, to increase plane service. And so you have a Cascadia Air Service, which is going to have the first electric planes, for short distance travel, taking off and being a commuter flight between Vancouver and Seattle. You have fiber optics being built. You have all of these different ways in which we are finding that it's more effective to work here together than it is to work through a bureaucratic, cumbersome, and increasingly non-representative system that's thousands of miles away on the East Coast.
Forbes, I know that we're equals and co-hosts, but I'm making an executive decision. Brandon, we were talking about, before the virus really hit, we wanted to take this on the road and do a road show going all through California. Forbes, making the executive decision, we're going to Oregon and we're going to Washington as well, because this interview has been so uplifting and exciting. Like, I just got to get back to visit the Pacific Northwest. So,
you know what, Bill, I just, this is just typical of your just little mini dictatorship you have here. But you know what? Broken clocks and all that. I think you're right.
Oh, yeah. First we'll have to go to Powell's bookstore in Oregon. I'll spend a half a day there looking for chess books. And then I'll have to take the wife and kids. Northwest Trek was one of my favorite places I've ever been. And my wife insists there's apparently a caboose hotel where it's all cabooses in Washington State. And she's like, we're staying there. So it's happening.
Full disclosure, by the way, I've actually never been to Oregon. So actually this would be quite exciting for me. I actually have not been north of San Francisco. Well, actually, I guess north of like Napa. That's the furthest I've gone in California. I grew up in Chicago until I was 12 and moved out to Seal Beach, California, which is in SoCal. But yeah, never got up that way. So it would actually be very exciting. So, Bill, I mean, again, you're being very domineering as usual. And again, I'm uncomfortable, but I think I'll go with it.
And I'll tell you, Forbes, like from Humboldt County to Washington State, someone once described the beauty as overwhelming. And that is that's a very accurate description. So Brandon, thank you so much. Keep being the leader. And we're going to keep stealing ideas from you. I think next sporting event I can go to, I'll have a California flag. I love that part of your movement. And thank you for your time on a Friday night.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been quite enlightening and quite an education. Thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure. And what's really exciting is, so if you've never even been north of San Francisco, then you haven't seen the redwoods. So, Mount Shasta, redwoods, Crater Lake up in Oregon. And I mean, there's a lot of wonderful road trips to be had. And I think you might understand the Cascadian identity and sentiment even more after you take that trip. So
actually, it would be very exciting for me because, I've heard so many good things. Bill has talked it up before, actually. So again, like, no, I'd be down for that. That'd be a hell of a thing, actually. That'd be great.
Yeah, when you think you care about the environment now, wait until you go to the Pacific Northwest. It will be like you'll be like Charlie Bucket going to the chocolate factory.
And I'd even say go so far as make sure to get up to, bring a passport if you have one, and jump on a clipper from Seattle, and you can take a day trip up to Victoria. You can take some of the ferries out to the San Juan Islands or the Gulf Islands or up to Vancouver, BC, just to kind of complete your journey. There's some beautiful mountains and stuff. But I'd also like to just also end on saying, what I love about the Cascadia movement, and I think the California movement is similar, is that it really is a grassroots movement. And so, we always talk about it being a movement of leaders, and rather than a leaderless revolution or a leaderless movement, we talk about devolution as opposed to revolution, and then a movement of leaders that can empower every person to be active and engaged. And I think that's actually my favorite part about Cascadia and the Cascadia movement is honestly seeing people who are much smarter than I am, seeing the creativity that people bring to it, and just the ideas that people have for approaching situations that I would have never dreamed of in my life, and being able to encourage those and say, hey, you have a place here in this movement, and watching the things that grow from that is truly inspirational. So it's always a joy, and thank you again for having me today.
Oh, we'll have you on again soon. I have a feeling that if you're willing, you will become a reoccurring guest. This was a lot of fun, and thank you once again.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, and let's all look towards November and just see how things continue to play out. And I hope that everything stays safe in Oakland and in other places.
Well, there you have it. Another episode of the Free the Bear podcast. Thank you very much for listening. If you can, give it a thumbs up. Even if you didn't like it, give it that good old thumbs up and subscribe. I'm very old, but I've been told there is a bell that you're supposed to push or ding or something. So do that. For more information about the California National Party, go to californianational.party. Or on Twitter, vote_CNP. And in conclusion,
Free the bear. Grrr.